My name's Gordon Stevenson, so I work for International Beverage Holdings as the export sales manager covering North America. So we own 5 distilleries in Scotland. We have Old Pulteney, which we have here as well. So Old Pulteney is our flagship single malt from Wick, way up the far northeast coast of Scotland. So it's in the Highland region. Staying in the Highland region and coming a little bit further south, about 45 minutes north of Inverness, we have our Balblair distillery, which is our most premium single malt in our lineup. And then also in the Highland region, but jumping right the way across and right through Speyside and kind of the eastern side of Speyside, we have our Cnoc distillery, which is the home of our An Cnoc single malt, which is a little bit more quirky and fun. And then we have our last 2 distilleries, which are both right in the heart of Speyside. Speyburn, which is very much more of our entry level, getting people to understand the Speyside region, try something from Speyside. Maybe trade up from blends or come across from whether it be Canadian whiskies or American whiskies, bourbons, anything else really. They just want to try a single malt Scotch whisky. And then lastly, we have our Balblair distillery, which is, as you're driving north in Scotland, it's one of the first that you'll arrive at in the Speyside region. We don't actually have a single malt from Balblair at present. It is our second biggest distillery in terms of production though, behind Speyburn. And the whisky that we're producing at present goes into our blends. So the likes of Cato's that's here in the Canadian market, or Hankey Bannister, that's where it's primary use. But Balblair is also the home of our Caroon premium Scottish gin. So looking at Old Pulteney in particular, that we have here, of the 2 that we've got that I'll show you today. So Old Pulteney being our flagship single malt, there's a range right now available at the SAQ. We have our core 12-year-old expression. Then we have our new range, which is Huddart, which is the new non-age that I'll talk a little bit more about. Our 15-year-old, our 18-year-old, and then there's also small quantities of our 25-year-old and 1983 vintage that are still in the market as well. Old Pulteney is one of the oldest distilleries in the Highlands. It dates back to 1826. It's a town called Wick. So it's one of the most northern distilleries, as I mentioned. Basically, if you're heading right up, you're only about a couple of miles away from John O'Groats, the most northern tip on the mainland of Scotland. The town of Wick was a famous herring fishing port back in the 1850s. It was actually the biggest herring fishing port in Europe at that time, with over 1,000 boats. So the population of the town was about 4,000 people, and it would rise to about 10 to 12,000 during the fishing season. So as you can imagine, it was pretty rowdy. There was a lot going on, and a very busy town at that time. It got so rowdy that we actually had prohibition in the town. So for 25 years, so 1922 to 1947, Wick was a dry town, which is quite unusual for us. One thing that we say, we really classify ourselves as the maritime malt, and that comes through in both the history of the town and the place, but on the whisky itself. So being right beside the coast, as our warehouses sit on top of the cliffs there, as the casks breathe, they actually take on some of that sea air and the surrounding landscape. The shape of the bottle is actually designed to look like the shape of the still, the wash still. So the story goes that when we put in the still, it didn't fit. So in true Scottish fashion, we cut off the top and we put the line arm out the side. So rather than having your traditional swan neck, the arm's out the side. But this adds to the character of the whisky or the spirit that we're producing, because during distillation, the vapors get stuck in the bulb. They then only have a short distance to go, so the more heavy, oily vapors get through. So you get a more oily, briny style of whiskey and a really long finish. So the 12-year-old is sea salty, oily, briny, as I mentioned, purely matured in bourbon casks. So you get a little bit of vanilla notes coming through there, some dried fruits, some apples and pears. I would say it's a really approachable whiskey and a great one to get people's palates going, whether you're starting the night or if it's people who are new to Scotch whiskey, it's a really good place to start. With the new range, we decided we wanted to do something a little bit different and show some different character from Old Pulteney. So that's what we have here in Huddart. So Huddart is actually named after the street that the distillery sits on, which is Huddart Street. What we've done here is we've tried to recreate an expression that we released a few years ago, which was a 1989 vintage. The 1989 vintage actually won the world's best whiskey in the World Whisky Awards in 2016, but it was a limited edition. It sold out very quickly, it's long gone. What we've done is, this is a recreation of that. So this has been matured exclusively in American oak bourbon barrels, but it's been finished for a short period of time in bourbon barrels that previously held a heavily peated whiskey. So while we're not running our own peated spirit at Pulteney, we feel that the spirit, being coastal, and a lot of coastal distilleries do have that peated element, having an element of peat coming through really works well with the spirit. So it's quite unusual that we're actually getting just a little bit of that peatiness, but it comes from the wood rather than the process. So that's quite unusual. That's a little bit about Old Pulteney. So An Cnoc, funnily enough, An Cnoc or Knock Do Distillery and Pulteney actually quite closely linked, and that's through our distillery managers. So our distillery manager at Knock Do at An Cnoc is Gordon Bruce, and he's actually from Wick, whereas our distillery manager Malcolm Wearing at Old Pulteney, he spent 6 years as the distillery manager at Knock Do prior to moving back. So he moved back in 2004, and Gordon has been there since. As I said, An Cnocs are kind of quirky, a little bit different, a little bit niche. Nobody can ever pronounce the name, especially with that big C in the middle of it. So it's a knock, like a knock on the door, and that's Gaelic for the hill. It's unusual that the whiskey does not share the name of the distillery. So the distillery is actually called Knock Do, and Knock Do is Gaelic for Black Hill. So the water source is covered in heather. The distillery sits just at the foot of the hill, and at certain times of the year it looks black. So that's where the distillery name comes from, and the village of Knock as well. So the core range, most of the core range are available at the SAQ now. They do come and go. So we have the core 12-year-old expression. Now I think the 12-year-old has this, it's got a real underlying level of complexity to it. As I said, we are a Highlands single malt, but right on the edge of Speyside, there's a lot of quirky notes going on there. It's really approachable. It's kind of citrusy, fresh, it's fruity, it's floral. We then have our 18-year-old and our 24-year-old, and gradually as you work your way up the range, you're getting more and more influence from those sherry casks. So the 18-year-old has actually won the world's best Highland single malt, aged 13 to 20 in the World Whisky Awards. That replaced our 16-year-old a few years ago and has been a really big success. And then we've got our 24-year-old, that's our full sherry bomb that spent the entire life in these sherry casks, but it's a combination of American oak and Spanish oak or European oak. We've got 2 new products that are just about to land in the SAQ within the next few weeks, hopefully, give or take. We're celebrating the 125th anniversary at the distillery. September 2019 was the 125th anniversary, so only 4 months ago. And to try to celebrate that, what we've done is we've released 2 limited edition expressions, and these are very limited. There's only 1,800 bottles of each in the world. One of the real favorites of the distillery team that worked there is a 16-year-old, but we discontinued the 16-year-old about 4 years ago. So in testament to them, we've re-released it, but we've done it with a twist. So we've done a 16-year-old, but it's at cask strength, and this is the first time we've released a cask strength whiskey from An Cnoc. It's at 56.3% and purely matured in bourbon casks. And it's been a big success so far, even though it's just new to the market or new to the global market. The other one we've done, I'll talk about after this. So one thing, when we look back at the distillery and look back to the roots, we noticed that just based on the surrounding landscape, they would have been producing a heavily peated malt. Now the core range, the 12-year-old, 18-year-old, 24-year-old, there's no peat whatsoever in that. So we wanted to recreate that. So back in 2004, we started to run our own peated malt and started to lay that down in casks. And then in 2013, we actually released the peated collection, so a range of limited edition single malts, most of which have been in the market and have sold through. So we had all named after traditional peat cutting tools, so rutter, flotter, cutter, rascan. And then we ran out of tools, and the most recent one, what we've done is we've gone to peat heart, and this is going to be an ongoing expression where we'll release batches. So this is still batch number 1. They're non-aged expressions, but what we're doing is we're actually quantifying the level of peat there that's in the product itself. So this is 40 ppm, so 40 parts per million. So this is a heavily peated whiskey. But with peat heart, what I would really say is the peat is very different to your Islay style of peat. When you think of peated whiskies, you're automatically going to that Islay region. Now that's coastal, the peat's damp, it's wet, so you get much more of a heavier iodine medicinal note coming through on it, whereas at An Cnoc, at Knock Do, the peat that we're using is from the Highlands, so it's local to the distillery and it's more inland, so it's a much cleaner style of peat. So it's, for me, across the range, it's more like burning wood on a campfire, so it's much cleaner smoke and you still get the kind of sweet and fruity floral notes that you get on the An Cnoc core range. Peat Heart and the other peated collection, they've only been matured in ex-bourbon barrels so far, so quite pale in colour. But what they lack in colour, they definitely don't lack in flavour, I can tell you that for sure. But what we've done, so for the 125th anniversary edition, it's just called Peat. And it's also at 40 parts per million, the same as Peat Heart, but it's been matured in Oloroso sherry butts. So you'll notice a much, much darker colour and a completely different flavour profile coming through than what you get on the other range. So much more of those kind of toffee, chocolate notes, and also your kind of raisins and figs that you get, but also the peat is certainly still there as it is in the peat heart and throughout those ranges. So we're really excited to have them come to the market shortly. Yeah, so one thing to look out for that's coming up, it's on the water at the moment coming over here and we're really excited about, is our new Balblair core range. So just last year we took the decision to change and move away from what we had been doing with Balblair, which were vintage releases. So you may know the likes of the 2005, 1999, 1990, and they were a big success, particularly here in Quebec where they did very well. But what we've done is we've gone back to the roots again of the distillery and more the traditional. So we've gone back to age statements. So we have a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 25-year-old. So the 12, 15, and 18 should be here very shortly. And in true Balblair style, they are our most premium in the lineup, bursting with character, bursting with flavour, and that rich goodness that is Balblair. So something fun to look out for when they come.